Here's another game firmly lumped in the category of should have played ages ago but didn't. Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis came out in 1992, the same year as the CD-ROM version of The Secret of Monkey Island. Fate of Atlantis got a talkie CD-ROM version about a year later. And I did play Monkey Island at the time, so the only excuse I have is that back then I was limited to what the shops had stocked, or, in the case of LucasArts games at least, what I could convince my parents to mail order from America. And they were confused enough when I asked for the registered version of Doom that one Christmas, so I doubt that was going to happen. So I missed a bunch of games from around that time. Fate of Atlantis looks like standard LucasArts pointy-clicky fare, right? Well, it would be easy enough to just say that the game has a standard Indiana Jones plot and leave it at that. Indy seeks artifact, teams up with lady, fights Nazis, travels by map, whips all the things, etc. But even if there wasn't more to it than that, and there is, that's probably what most people would want from an Indiana Jones game in the first place. So what does happen? Well, Indy starts the game lost, verbless, and on the hunt for an idol. He gracefully descends through the floors of a museum until he finds what he's after. Why it's in the room most likely to melt the damn thing is not really explained. He returns the item to his office, where a fellow scholar and visiting German-accented man, Mr. Smith, he's not evil, are waiting. Indy shows off his prize and Mr. Smith, he's not evil, is fascinated, especially after it dispenses a shiny, glittering bead. At which point the American scholars have a gun pulled on them, and after a good old punch-up, the item is lost to the grubby hands of Mr. Smith, he's not evil, who leaves his coat behind, revealing a Nazi passport. The German-accented man with blonde hair and blue eyes who wears a trench coat and steals priceless artifacts at gunpoint is a Nazi? What is this, 1939? Oh wait, that's exactly what it is. Okay. Mr. Smith, okay, he was evil, was also carrying an old copy of National Archaeology magazine, turned to an article about a dig in Iceland that Dr. Jones was in charge of, featuring pictures of him and then assistant Sophia Hapgood. Surmising that she may also be targeted by the Third Reich, Indy goes off to warn her and find out about the statue. And so begins the adventure. Since the item is reported to be a relic of Atlantis, if you couldn't guess, the rest of the game has Indy searching for the mythical city itself, both because he's the most badass archaeologist in history, sorry Lara, and because the Germans are hunting it down to make a super weapon. Believe it or not, they kind of have a history of doing this sort of thing. As I said before, Fate of Atlantis is a standard Scum Engine game for the most part, so if you've played a LucasArts adventure game from the 90s, you'll know how it goes. Point, click, verbs, inventory, dialogue, etc. There's rarely much to find wrong in a 90s era Scum game, although I should be more annoyed that it has a list of verbs, something that hasn't been necessary since 1990, but the Scum engine has keyboard shortcuts for them all, so it never really bothered me quite as much, even if they clearly ran out of letters and had to assign pull to the Y key. Given all that, what does Fate of Atlantis do differently? Something I've been wanting to see in point-and-click adventures for years. Multiple solutions to puzzles. Okay, this really only happens a few times, but it's enough that a game this old features it at all. The game is split into the paths of team, wits and fists, and if you didn't read the manual or press the I key at some point, you probably didn't notice you'd chosen one at all. The path of team has you chumming up to people and talking your way out of or into situations. The path of wits has you employing your brain meat and lateral thinking skills to get the desired result. The path of the fists is obvious. Which one you finally end up with gets decided about a third of the way through. What you've done up to this point will hint at which path suits you, but you ultimately decide for yourself. Your path will yield puzzles, dialogue, and sometimes even whole cutscenes unique to that path. I've only properly played through the game once, so I might end up mentioning things you yourself won't see or omitting things that you do. This different paths design is a real joy for replay value and water cooler talk. Not to mention it lets you play to your strengths. It also helps determine the most noticeable change, which is whether your archaeologist turned psychic companion Sophia Hapgood sticks around with you for the duration. I have to say, it was a bold decision to have a main character, sidekick or not, more or less an optional player in the story. The team path is where you'll see the most of her, and from what this wikia tells me, you barely see her on the wits path at all. Although no matter which path you're on, she'll get kidnapped. Okay, developers, a bit lazy, but at least their main reason for kidnapping her is her knowledge of Atlantis rather than the sole reason that she's a romantic interest. Or maybe I'm just making excuses for an otherwise good game. An otherwise good game where you can leave a woman in a jail cell. So anyway, the other significant deviation from formula is that the puzzles are randomised on each playthrough. This doesn't work as well as I'd hoped, but it's no biggie, just means you might find a key to an empty box once in a while. Don't lose heart, the solution is still out there. You just came across a red herring is all. I'll forgive Fate of Atlantis for this. The fact that it has randomised puzzles and multiple solutions is enough for me to pass over this little side effect. Even if you judge it purely as a point and click game, it holds up. A CD-ROM release means you're getting the full 256 colours, trust me, it was a bigger deal at the time, and full voice acting. You might have to ignore the fact that it's definitely not Harrison Ford and his chiseled jawline providing Indy's voice, or the fact that some of the German accents would have been deemed too silly for an episode of Allo Allo. Let's face it, the main German scientist you see in the cutscenes? This Dr. Fred from Day of the Tentacle with an even sillier accent. There's just no getting round that.
Behold, children, the Chronogon!
Now, having multiple puzzle solutions would have been absolutely pointless if the puzzles themselves were no good. But aside from that one that involved pixel hunting for some sliding boxes, to which there are alternatives anyway, they're all solid with no moon logic to be found. There's a few times where you might be asked to analyse a text in order to decipher a solution, which is a nice intellectual break from chatting folk up and rubbing items together. If that gets too much for you, there's this old trick which is usually used early on in a point and click game. You're given multiple goals to complete and you decide on the order to do them in. It means if you get stuck on a particular puzzle, you can just work on another one instead of getting frustrated by a lack of progress. That said, it usually happens at the beginning of the game, getting very linear towards the end. This game isn't an exception. The worst thing I can say about how the game implements this trick is it makes for a lot of travelling back and forth between locations. But that just means new areas, more puzzles, more witty banter between characters, and all that good stuff. The worst thing I can say about the game as a whole, however, is the hot air balloon sequence controls like utter arse. Seriously, fuck that noise. And the submarine section isn't much better. And if the worst thing I can point out about this game is 2 vehicle sections, I think they've done pretty good. If this review turned out atypical, it's probably because I took a different approach to playing the game. Rather than jump straight into something I'd never played more than a demo of until nearly 2 decades after its release, yes, I'm old, I took note from a certain other internet games reviewer who named herself after a Grim Fandango reference, and asked my significant other if she'd like to play it with me, which she did, so that worked out nicely. Since I'd barely played this and she hadn't touched it since she was a kid, we were both more or less coming at this fresh. But when my experience of the genre failed to yield results, she could hint towards things she remembered doing back in the day. If you've not tried playing games with your dearly befuddled, I'd urge you to do so. It's a lot of fun, and if nothing else, you can share frustration when you get stuck. It doesn't even need to be co-op. My girlfriend's sister and her boyfriend have played a bunch of single player games together. And if you're looking for a place to start, something both of you can be involved in, something where you can contribute to solving puzzles without necessarily being the one at the controls, you can do it a lot worse than this. Shove your hand into a pile of old floppies and CD-ROMs, get it from the fine people at Steam, figure out how to unlock it in Staff of Kings, whichever path you choose to take, you should absolutely give this a go.